That image lodged itself in people's memory for a reason. A single frozen second on a Monday afternoon, the President of the United States stood at the lectern in the East Room, two flags flanking him, and a trade advisor nearby whose expression had visibly shifted over the last 90 seconds. Then came the declaration. Beginning at 1 inch the morning on Thursday, the United States would impose a 50% tariff on every single category of Canadian goods crossing the southern border. Not 25%, not the gradual step-up the White House communications staff had been signaling for weeks. 50% flat. It was the steepest single-step tariff escalation directed at an allied economy in the 8-9-year history of the modern American trade framework. The president read the figure straight off the teleprompter, looked up, then added one off-script sentence that had never appeared in the prepared remarks distributed to the press pool earlier. Let's see how long they hold out. There was no exit ramp attached to it. No negotiation window, no consultation process, no exemptions, no phase-in period, no reference to private diplomatic channels. Just a direct announcement, a 50% wall at the world's busiest commercial border, going live in 62 hours. At the time of the announcement, the Canadian ambassador was sitting in on a meeting at the Brookings Institution when her phone started lighting up. According to 3 staff members who later described the scene, she barely flinched, stayed through the remaining 11 minutes of the discussion, thanked the panel, and quietly walked out to her car. Once inside, she made one phone call to Ottawa lasting 41 seconds. There was no anger in that call. No request for guidance, no procedural questions, none of the standard diplomatic language anyone would expect following a move that dramatic. According to 2 officials from the Privy Council office who later reviewed the transcript for the Globe and Mail, the ambassador said exactly 5 words. Execute the contingency tonight. The contingency already had a name. Inside the Privy Council, it was known as Annex 7. At the Bank of Canada, it carried the label, the mirror provision. Inside the Department of Finance, people called it simply the file. The memo recommended that any maximum pressure move by the U.S. be met not with retaliatory tariffs, but with a coordinated, prearranged, technically routine acceleration of disengagement from the financial architecture that underpinned American sovereign debt. It was not a sanction, not a freeze, not a hostile sell-off, just a rapid, precise execution of processes that had been quietly building for 30 months, carried out in a single coordinated sequence across 22 institutions. Time to reach the bond market before the tariffs even hit the border. And here is what made this moment unlike anything before it. It was not retaliation. It was not punishment. It was not about inflicting proportional damage in response to the American tariff. The goal was to demonstrate, in purely operational terms, that the American system no longer controlled the bilateral financial architecture the way it believed it did. The execution began at 8:47 p.m. Eastern on Monday. Over the next 4 hours, 22 operational instruments were triggered in a coordinated sequence. The Bank of Canada routed $84 billion in cross-border commercial transactions through the multilateral clearing framework in Zurich rather than the usual New York correspondent banks. A migration that had been in progress for 30 months but had never been completed in a single day. Major Canadian institutional investors, including the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, and the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, managing a combined $2.84 trillion in assets, completed a long-planned rebalancing that cut their U.S. sovereign and corporate holdings by $187 billion over 96 hours. The Department of Finance triggered pre-arranged currency swaps with the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and the Swiss National Bank, totaling $341 billion in deployable capacity across 2 weeks. The Bank of Canada also activated a previously dormant facility for direct multilateral settlement of U.S.-Canada trade through the Zurich Clearinghouse, capable of handling the entire volume of goods that would have crossed the tariff-affected border. Each instrument was routine on its own. Each had been disclosed in regulatory filings over the prior 18 months and had been operational on paper for 9 to 22 months. What made the move extraordinary was the coordination. 22 instruments executed across 96 hours, reaching the bond market 26 hours before the U.S. tariff even took effect. The market reaction started at 4:14 inches the morning Tuesday as Asian trading desks priced in the accelerated moves. By the time European markets opened, the 1-0-year U.S. Treasury yield had already climbed 31 basis points overnight. When New York opened, it rose another 19. By the close of Tuesday, the 1-0-year yield had moved 71 basis points. The largest single-session shift in modern U.S. Treasury history. The Federal Reserve was forced to deploy $410 billion in pre-positioned liquidity within 7 hours of the European Open, the largest intervention outside a formally declared financial crisis. But even that could not prevent the 30-year Treasury auction on Wednesday afternoon from hitting the lowest bid-to-cover ratio in 31 years, falling to 1.81. Those 38 hours between Annex 7's activation and the scheduled start of the tariffs shattered every assumption behind the American escalation. A National Economic Council memo, leaked afterward, had assumed Canada possessed no structural response to a maximum pressure tariff. That assumption was technically accurate at the goods trade layer. It was catastrophically wrong at every other level of the bilateral relationship. Canada had not responded with tariffs at all. Instead, it acted at the layer American planners had never anticipated: financial settlement and sovereign credit. The layer Canada had been quietly diversifying away from over 30 months, absorbing the capacity to weather confrontation with minimal disruption. Mark Carney stepped to the podium at the Sir John A. Macdonald Building in Ottawa at 2:47 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday, just over 9 hours before the tariff was set to take effect. Dressed in a charcoal suit, he carried no notes and spoke for 89 seconds. He did not mention the East Room announcement. He did not name the president. He did not repeat the 50% figure, the 12:01 a.m. effective time, or the offhand remark about seeing how long Canada would last. Instead, he spoke about the nature of response. He began by acknowledging that the U.S. had announced a 50% tariff on Canadian goods set for Thursday morning, the most aggressive escalation in the bilateral trade relationship since 1930. He noted that observers had been asking for 38 hours when and how Canada would respond. Then he looked into the camera and laid out what had already happened. The Government of Canada, he said, had responded. The response had begun at 8:47 p.m. Monday evening, 90 minutes after the East Room announcement, and had been completed within a coordinated 9-6-hour window that was now substantially finished. The response had not been a tariff. It had not been a countermeasure aimed at American goods entering Canada. It had not been a sanction, a freeze, an embargo, or any other instrument of bilateral commercial confrontation. The response had been the activation, in coordinated sequence, of 22 separate operational facilities across the Canadian financial system, constructed quietly for precisely this contingency over the preceding 19 months. He paused, let it settle, then delivered the 7 words now codified in the standing procedures of central bank reserves committees around the world. We do not match, we invert. He unpacked them on 2 levels. On the surface, the words meant exactly what they said. Canada had declined to respond symmetrically to the American escalation, imposing no 50% counter-tariff on U.S. goods and no action at the goods trade layer where the American escalation had been aimed. Instead, Canada had inverted the engagement, moving into the financial settlement and sovereign credit layer, the structural vulnerability Washington had overlooked. While Canada spent 30 months deliberately diversifying its exposure to absorb confrontation with minimal disruption, the inversion had not been improvised. It had been pre-positioned across 22 institutions for 19 months, ready for exactly this escalation. Beneath the surface, Carney explained, the 7 words carried a deeper meaning. The era of symmetrical retaliation between sovereign nations had ended. Symmetrical retaliation had assumed both sides held comparable exposure across similar layers. That had defined U.S.-Canada relations for decades, but it was no longer the case. Canada had diversified structurally while the U.S. had concentrated its exposure. The asymmetry was now operational. Any maximum pressure American escalation could be met by a Canadian response calibrated not to match, but to expose the layer where the pressure was unsustainable. Canada had inverted the engagement, and it would do so again in any future escalation of similar magnitude. The inversion was not a one-time measure. It was the new doctrine. He repeated the 7 words one final time. We do not match, we invert. He thanked the journalists and left the podium. By the time the tariff went live at 12:01 a.m. Thursday, it had already become operationally irrelevant. Warren Buffett, watching from Omaha, called 5 of his portfolio managers within an hour of Carney's statement. According to one manager, Buffett opened with a single observation. The most expensive moment in any confrontation is discovering that the other side has been preparing for an entirely different fight than the one you announced. He explained that the strategic mistake of every great power that has lost momentum in a bilateral confrontation is assuming the smaller party will respond at the layer where the escalation was pitched. Tariffs invite counter-tariffs. Sanctions invite counter-sanctions. Symmetrical response had long been treated as a law of nature by the larger party's political class, but it was just one option. And it was the option the smaller party should never choose if it had spent time diversifying while the larger party concentrated. Canada had built exactly this asymmetric capability over 30 months. The Canadian architecture had been quiet, technical, multilateral, and deliberately spread across 22 institutions to ensure no single entity's exposure could compromise the system. When the activation happened, it looked routine. Each of the 22 instruments was standard on its own, but together, they created the largest single-week movement in modern U.S.-Canada financial history. And the American political system had no tools to respond at the layer where Canada had acted. The Treasury could not impose a tariff on something that was not being purchased. The trade representative could not negotiate to restore holdings that pension funds had already rebalanced. And the president could not announce a measure that would compel sovereign nations to reverse routine decisions made by their central banks within their own monetary frameworks. The escalation had struck one layer. The response came from another, precisely the one where the U.S. architecture had no defenses. Warren Buffett's remark to his portfolio managers, which spread quickly through notes from Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and Morgan Stanley, said it plainly. Symmetry was the gift you give to your enemies. The smart ones have stopped accepting it. The cascade was structural and immediate. By Thursday's close, the first full trading day under the 50% tariff regime, the market reaction was severe. The S&P 500 fell 5.4% on volume, running 91% above the trailing 30-day average, its largest single-session decline in 38 months. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 1,840 points. The Nasdaq shed 6.1%. And the U.S. dollar fell 5.7% against the Canadian dollar, 4.1% against the euro, 4.8% against the yen, 5.4% against the Australian dollar, and 6.2% against the Swiss franc. The DXY index recorded its largest single-session decline in 27 years. The 10-year Treasury, which had already moved 71 basis points on Tuesday, shifted another 38 points by Thursday, a total weekly movement of 109 basis points, the largest in modern U.S. Treasury history. And the 3-0-year auction on Wednesday cleared at the lowest bid-to-cover ratio in 31 years, prompting the Federal Reserve to deploy $410 billion in emergency liquidity within 96 hours. Rating agencies moved quickly. J.P. Morgan downgraded the U.S. sovereign outlook to credit watch within 31 minutes of Carney's statement. Moody's followed within 2 hours. Fitch within 5. Goldman Sachs estimated the total direct cost to the United States of the 3 8-hour window between Annex 7's activation and the tariffs effective date at $419 billion. $284 billion in market capitalization loss, $94 billion in sovereign credit repricing, and $41 billion in projected additional Treasury financing costs over the following 4 quarters. All of it generated by just 90 minutes of presidential commentary that the National Economic Council had expected to extract roughly $61 billion from Canada over 18 months. The speed and candor of reactions were remarkable. The governor of Michigan stated that her state's auto sector had been preparing for the inversion response for 14 months, because her chief economist had reviewed publicly available Canadian financial disclosures far more carefully than the federal government had. Ohio's steel sector had completed similar preparations. Texas's energy sector had completed multilateral hedging over the previous 17 months. California's tech sector had been operating under multilateral settlement for 22 months. Iowa senators noted that agricultural cooperatives had completed financial repositioning the previous year. Pennsylvania's steel component manufacturers had hedged 14 months earlier. The CEOs of General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, and Boeing confirmed their companies were already positioned to operate through the tariff window without disruption. Meanwhile, industry groups, including the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Iron and Steel Institute, the American Petroleum Institute, and the Farm Bureau Federation called for an emergency congressional review of the prior 30 months, questioning why the doctrine of symmetrical retaliation had guided U.S. planning despite Canada's carefully constructed asymmetric response across automotive, steel, agriculture, energy, and aerospace. 614,000 American jobs now existed inside a relationship governed not by symmetry, but by inversion. On a Monday afternoon, the president announced from the East Room that beginning at 12:01 a.m. Thursday, a 50% tariff would hit every category of Canadian goods crossing into the United States, and the Canadian ambassador made a single 4-1-second phone call from her car. By 8:47 p.m. Monday evening, Annex 7 was activated, and over the next 96 hours, 22 separate Canadian financial institutions executed scheduled rebalancing, swap activations, settlement migrations, and pension fund repositioning, all pre-positioned over the prior 19 months for exactly this scenario. Goldman Sachs calculated that these coordinated actions imposed $419 billion in direct costs on the United States in just 38 hours, delivered at the sovereign credit, currency, and bond market layers, precisely where the U.S. had concentrated its exposure over 30 months of confrontation. Mark Carney addressed a podium in Ottawa at 2:47 p.m. Wednesday, 9 hours before the tariff was to take effect, delivering 7 words now part of the standing operating procedure of every central bank reserves committee in the world. We do not match. We invert. The tariff officially went live at 12:01 a.m. Thursday. By then, the 10-year Treasury had shifted 109 basis points in a single week. The DXY index had recorded its largest single-session drop in 27 years, and JP Morgan, Moody's, and Fitch had all revised the U.S. sovereign outlook within 24 hours. 4 governors, 4 senators, and 12 Fortune 500 CEOs confirmed that the inversion architecture had already been factored into their operations for 14 to 22 months. Warren Buffett, observing from Omaha, noted that symmetry was the gift the U.S. had historically handed to its enemies, and the smart ones had stopped accepting it. Now the questions are being raised in every Treasury auction room, central bank committee, congressional office, and kitchen table from Detroit to Des Moines. Can the United States restore the doctrine of symmetrical retaliation that governed bilateral economic confrontation for 84 years? After a smaller party has already demonstrated $419 billion in operational consequences? Or has the very act of inversion, proven and repeatable, already shut down the escalation pathways the American system was built to deploy when the smaller party chooses to invert instead of match? We do not match. We invert. I'm Ashton for CA News Studio.